Hi, my name is Elisa Minkin. I'm the chair of the JOMA Preventative Health Committee and a general pediatrician. And I'm here tonight with Dr. Perella Perlstein. Dr. Perlstein is a psychologist and assistant professor of psychology and faculty advisor at Touro College. She received her PhD in psychology from Hofstra University. She has a private clinical practice in Brooklyn, New York. She's also co-author of the book, along with Shiva, the book Secrets of Great Teachers, 22 Strategies to Energize Middle and High School Classrooms. She can be reached at her email, I'm going to spell this, perella.perlstein, Perella dot Perlstein at Touro, Touro.edu, and at her phone number 347-731-9837. And we're going to talk about grief and loss and the dealing basically with the emotional fallout of COVID-19. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Dr. Perlstein.
Sure, absolutely.
So if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with your personal story, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so it's a loaded topic.
Yeah, it's hard.
Loss. Yeah, grief and loss, and really adjusting to COVID, and we're still not over it, so we're still in it, which makes the whole thing kind of interesting. But I would say that the focal point for me really concerns my father.
Mm,
And I lost my father to COVID. At this point, I mean, because your site is Yudches Nissan. It was
mm,
Holomoid, so
mm,
that would be, and we're in Tammuz now, so I'm just trying to think, about 3 months. It should be about 3 months. And one of the things that I find really challenging is that the loss of someone in these circumstances, and every loss is unique, but
mm,
the loss that I would say here is that it's sort of um, it's entrapped, so to speak, in tragedy
mm,
and trauma,
mm,
because the way in which it happened, and I've been speaking to some other people about it. In other words, like their own experiences. I've had a couple of clients who've lost spouses, to COVID,
mm,
and they all have similar experiences, which is that it happened very quickly,
mm,
and it's sort of like it almost feels like a car accident, you
mm,
know, because 1 minute he was fine, and then the next minute he wasn't, and also, even though there was like a 24 or 48-hour window, let's say that he got sick, he was in the hospital for 10 days, so
mm,
he got sick, I would say 2 weeks before he passed away. um and I didn't go see him because I was afraid to.
mm.
I have young children, and so I was, worried about that. And I don't regret it, because I think at the time I made the decision that I made, and I don't know if I would have made a different decision.
Were
Um,
you allowed to see him? Because that's when,
no, I mean, meaning before he was hospitalized.
oh, I
In
see.
other words, when he was home, and he was sort of like, at one point it was like, okay, let's, Hatzalah came. They said he's not sick enough to go to the hospital, and it
Mm,
was also at the peak of COVID.
right.
So unfortunately, I mean, the deaths at that point were like in the 700-800s per day in New
Mm,
York. So we're talking about at the peak of COVID. And
right.
so they really, and at that point my parents lived in Borough Park. My father lived in Borough Park. So,
Mm,
at that point they weren't even, the Hatzalah was not sending people to Maimonides anymore, because they were just past full
overloaded.
capacity.
Mm,
Yeah, and so they really waited until it was absolutely necessary, which actually for me right now I appreciate, because
mm,
you're always second guessing, like
right.
why, But anyway, but the point was that for me, um, I let's say I got the call on a Sunday, just to kind of give it, time context.
Mm,
And I didn't go see him Sunday. I didn't go see him Monday, and then Tuesday morning it was like, okay, that's he
I'm
my
sorry,
brother
you cut
was.
out a little. You cut out for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. So he wasn't doing
Mm,
well, and he also was not that he wasn't doing well, he also was confused at that point
Mhm.
because of lack
Mhm.
of oxygen,
Right.
oxygen depletion. So we knew, I mean, this was it,
Mhm.
and unfortunately, even in the hospital, and this is something that so many people struggle with, um, and including, a close friend of mine who lost her brother, you couldn't visit, you couldn't see
Right.
your loved ones, and you were really dependent on what you hoped was good care. And
Mhm.
today, just parent, just sort of like an aside, I see there's so much anger, which I want to get back to in a minute.
Mhm.
So much anger, which very often is part of loss and part of
Mhm.
grief, at the system, and
Right.
not any specific person, but I mean, people want to get specific. You can blame the governor, blame the mayor, you can
Mhm.
blame the cheer people at the hospital, you can blame the doctors and the nurses, but just so angry because you feel so helpless.
Right.
And so we were just waiting for that one phone call every single day. And so it was really, that just sort of made the experience that much more painful because even if you're doing nothing, you feel like you're doing something if you're there
Mhm.
with your loved ones. So the helplessness, very often when you look at trauma, you see there's a level of helplessness there that I
Mhm.
couldn't do anything more. And so it was part of that too. But ironically enough, I mean, he was the only one on his unit. Um, he was at Mount Sinai in the
Mhm.
city, and he was the only one in his unit that was not on a ventilator. And he was doing well. And we even had two Zoom meetings that we
Mhm.
arranged to have. And I had my little girl with me. She wasn't. I mean, now she's 2. And he even mentioned her name.
Mhm.
And like, oh, that's Malka. That was the last thing I ever heard him say. But the fact that he recognized her, you know,
Mhm.
told me that that he was coherent because you
Mhm.
couldn't tell he was on a BiPAP machine, but he wasn't on a ventilator, obviously.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we would have had heard him say anything.
Right.
But then, and over Yontif, don't forget this was Yontif too. So many of us are making Yontif for the first time. This
Mhm.
happened this year, and I have young children too. So everything was sort of happening at the same time. And so you're almost like in this sort of survival mode, like it's just not one day at a time. It's literally 1 hour at a time.
Mhm.
But we did get, and I think of it as a bracha, which is that over Yontif, my brother got a call that they moved him out of the ICU onto a med surg unit. So we did have some like really, we had contentment, there was
Mhm.
menuchas hanefesh over Yontif. But then Motzei Shabbos, which was the third day of Yontif, because the Chol Hamoed was the first day of the first day of Chol Hamoed fell out on a Shabbos. Um, I got a call that they had to put him on a ventilator, and then once I knew that, I knew, okay, that's it.
Mhm.
Um, it's over, and it was over within like 3-4 hours, and that was it.
Mhm.
Um, and so I don't, and I think that for so many people, especially that week it was like they said, and Miss Oskin was saying that close to 1,000 people were sitting Shiva
Oh, wow.
because if people died on Yontif, Shiva starts after Yontif.
Right.
So you had a lot of people sitting Shiva, a lot of people per family, but you also had a lot of people who had passed away over that Yontif period, and so Shiva started for everyone the same day, which was like that night, the night that Pesach was over. And then of course the Shiva was
Right.
and the Levias were so different, and it was like because you have a Leviah on let's say Chol Hamoed, but you're not. I mean, you're in technically in Anius, but you're not really. It's not Shiva. So and then you have Yontif, and then you have to sit Shiva. Um, and Shiva wasn't normal, right? Because you didn't have the same. And for me as well, it was like I couldn't even mourn properly
Right.
because I was at home with my kids. My husband took off, but still, it wasn't the same. At one point, it was like maybe the second or third day. I have a brother-in-law who's a physician, and I asked him. I said, do you think it's okay for me to sit shiva with my brothers, and my mother, because I couldn't. It wasn't providing me with what I thought shiva provides people with. You know,
Mhm.
because when you're sitting shiva, you have to sort of entrench yourself in the mourning and the sorrow. I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't do that. And I was just sort of thinking about even post Shiva, like the whole point of post Shiva is that there is a Shiva period. If you don't have the Shiva period, how are you supposed to move on, or at least continue to progress in some way, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we talked about it, and we talked about like, you know, risk assessment, and you know, was I a risk? Was I at risk? You know, that sort of thing. And he's like, you know, listen, mental health trumps it. I mean, he basically said, you know, you got to do what works for your mental health as well. And I
Let me just
did.
make sure I understand. What you mean is that you were originally planning on sitting individually so as not to potentially affect each other.
Right, exactly.
Oh, wow.
And I was, meaning that, let's say, just to, again, you know, the last day of Yontif is Thursday, so that takes away one day of Shiva because it's an extra day, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Shiva technically started Friday, and then there's Shabbos. So I really only had 3 days. And then Sunday morning, I'm like, this isn't working for me because, again, you know, the kids are around. I'm taking care of the kids, and and I'm sad,
Right.
obviously, you know.
Oh,
And I just needed that time. And also, the point of Shiva is to really talk about the person who
right.
play. I couldn't do that. And I also wanted to talk to people who felt the loss the way I felt that loss, which
Mm-hmm.
would be my brothers
Right.
and my mother. And so, you know, so yeah, so at first, and they were sitting together because they weren't worried so much, or
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, meaning, you know, they weren't that, you know, too concerned about it.
Right.
And
You were
also
more cautious. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was more cautious,
Mm-hmm.
and I was more, you know, and so, and I guess part of me was thinking like, you know, I didn't see my father before he went to the hospital. They did.
Mm.
It was almost like, and now I'm going to go see them. Like in my mind, I was like, oh no, like I just, you know, I passed on an opportunity to see my father before he was hospitalized, and so I felt almost like compelled, almost, you know, honor bound to myself to make that sacrifice, you know, to
Mm-hmm.
kind of prove that it made sense, you know,
Mm-hmm.
which was irrational. But, you know, so I spoke to my brother in law about it, and he was like, no, I think for your mental health, and, you know, you could sit further apart,
Right.
and you can wear a mask, which I brought, but I didn't end up wearing it the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
But I was careful enough, you know,
Right.
as much as I could be. And it made a very big difference. It was very necessary. It did. And so, you know, I don't know what people's, you know, experiences have been, but for me that was helpful. And you know, the fact that you don't have, you know, visitors, I didn't find that, because, you know, Baruch Hashem, I have no reference point. In other words, like I didn't have, oh well, last time, you know,
Right. Right.
the first time I'm sitting Shiva. So to me, it was like, okay, you know, and I was fine with it in a way, because if the phone rings and you're not like in a place to answer, you don't answer it. But when somebody
Mm-hmm.
visits, it's like, you know, you got to be on, you know.
Right.
So there were some advantages that I
Mm-hmm.
recognized, you know. Um, and it wasn't. It was just. It's really about. For me, it was also about just being able to process, you know, which,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but in any case, so what I find about this experience is that it's sort of the loss, you know, it was unexpected. It came out of nowhere. There was almost like this mass psychic grief, you know, mass psychic trauma,
Mm-hmm.
because so many people were affected at the same time. You know, maybe it wasn't that everyone could sort of say, oh, I lost someone, but everyone lost something,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know. Even your sense of just reassurance, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like
The
this
world is
is,
safe. It's not safe.
yeah, the world was not safe in this
Yeah.
pandemic. Like before this, it was like you know, we thought of the pandemic as like 1918, you know, with influenza. This doesn't
Mm-hmm.
happen in today's, you know, day and age. And also all the uncertainty, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
we still have all this uncertainty of like antibodies. Everyone's taking their antibodies test, and it's like, well, and now they're saying, you know, reinfection rates, and you know. So the point is, there's so much uncertainty here, and that's part of trauma too, because you don't know for sure whether or not you will be protected from a future event,
Mm-hmm.
and so you take whatever steps that you can take in order to minimize the probability of being affected by a future event. But then at what point do those steps become infringe on and restrict your life, you know? So that's where it's also a matter of just trying to figure out, what are the reasonable precautions that you take? And we all have to make these decisions. It's like, you know, at the beginning, it's like stay at home. The stay at home order, in a way, it was like you couldn't make any
Right.
decision.
Right. It was
Now,
universal. Everybody was the same.
yeah, now, are you sending your kid to day camp? Are you not? You know, are you choosing to take takeout food? Are you not? You know what I mean? Like everyone is making these decisions every day.
Right. Without adequate information to make them.
Right, exactly. Or even the media. There's so much fear mongering going on in the
Right.
media.
Right.
And especially as a parent, it's like terrifying to think that something that I do or don't do is going to affect my child's health. It's terrifying, you know?
Right.
So,
And I think we look to each other to see what's the right thing to do.
yes, exactly. But also that when I, let's say for instance, I chose to send my children to day camp,
Mm-hmm.
speaking to that same brother-in-law, and so who also is choosing to send his child to daycare,
Mm-hmm.
even though and he lives in Florida, and they're experiencing a peak there now,
Right.
So we talked about it, but the idea is that every time I hear about a parent who chooses not to send their child, it's like, what did I do? And then every time my
Was I
child comes
wrong?
home,
Right.
yeah, what am I doing? And then every day my child comes home from camp and is happy, I'm like, okay, maybe. And so you're sort of like, back and forth about these things because they're not easy decisions to make. It's not like we have guidelines to follow. In other words, the camps everything is legal. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not like I would ever do anything that was illegal because, especially where your children are concerned, it's like do what you possibly can do to keep them safe.
Right. And you made an important point 2 times already about your Shiva and being with your family and about sending to camp, about the need to balance risks and benefits, including mental health of your family members and also of family togetherness. And that's, I'm seeing a
Absolutely.
lot of discord
Absolutely.
as people are
Yeah.
starting to say, for example, make a wedding.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And some people we're over, we're done, COVID is gone. And that's not true.
No, no, it's
Right?
not.
Like
It's
it's
not.
not, especially in other states like Florida, which seem to be going back and forth to New York all the time. They're
Yeah,
surging there, and even relatively low here is not non-existent. But there are those who are done with it, and I'm sure we all want to be done with it,
yeah,
right?
we all
And
want
then
to be honest, but
in
it's
those same families, you have others who are continuing to be cautious, and some of
yeah,
these families members are high risk, and that
exactly.
to me is a whole other topic of what it's like to be
Yeah.
a high risk person, whether you're elderly, whether you have medical conditions, whether you have a child with medical conditions, or some
Sure.
combination of that,
Sure.
and feel that maybe everyone's moving on without me.
Yeah, exactly. Especially now as things begin to open up.
Mm-hmm.
And
Here,
so
yeah.
some people are moving on, some people are, and also the idea that not everyone agrees with the pace
Mm-hmm.
that we choose to move on to or with or at or and it's also the idea that I think that even when this happened, we all had to make certain decisions. So for instance, you know I was speaking to a close friend of mine who is a neighbor of mine as well, who lives in um, I live in an apartment building, and she was saying how she felt it was so she's single, lives alone, and she was saying how she felt it was so cruel when people were saying, do the Seder on your own. She's like,
Mm,
I don't want to do the Seder on my own. That's
right.
really, and when she said that to me, and at the time I was kind of careful, but at the time I'm like, something clicked. I'm like, and I told her, I said, just, you know what? We'll be what's the term now? Pod,
Bubble, yeah, I've heard that.
or bubble, right? And so she's come to me since
Good.
Pesach every Shabbos, and she sort of adopted our family. We've adopted her. There's a garden, outside our building, and we see each other all the time. And it's like, this is part. You have to make these decisions. Or I have a brother who's single, and I'm like, no, you're coming to me for all the meals. In other words, even at the height of COVID, even at the height of COVID, I still made certain decisions. Um, I still made certain decisions
Mm-hmm.
because I felt that, again, cost benefit analysis. If
Right.
we're all quarantining and she's quarantining, then this is what we're going to do. And so I was careful about, how far to extend the circle,
Mm-hmm.
but we all have to make that decision. And the idea that, understand, I mean, at one point I felt like speaking to certain people, especially the people who were so lonely, it was like I was
Right.
talking to someone who told me he works for Hatsala, but for the mental health division, and he was saying how the amount of calls that they
Mm.
got over the 3-day yontif of people that were just I don't depressed, but also even attempting suicide. He said it was
Oh,
ridiculous. It was horrendous. I mean, the number was 80. I don't know. I don't know if it was nationwide. I don't know where that number came from. But it doesn't matter to me because that number is an incredibly high number, especially in a community that abhors this idea.
right.
So the idea that at one point the refuah becomes the makkah, so to speak,
Right.
and so but you have to be mindful of the fact that that loneliness is and isolation is just it that perpetuates this, whatever mental health condition a person has is perpetuated under those circumstances.
Right. And I think it's important to keep in mind if you know people who could be isolated
Yeah,
to, and you're capable of reaching
exactly.
out
In some
to
way,
do that, because
yeah.
that you're
It's
right.
an
It's
obligation. It's not just something to do. It's an
right.
obligation
It's
to
not
do it.
nice, right? It's not just nice. It's absolute obligation.
No.
But to
I
be aware of it, because the problem that I see is that we're all in our own little pods. We're all isolated from each other, and that can be
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's sort of like as we open slowly, think of how to extend the pod into whom needs it the most, and how you can do that, and there's some creative ways of doing it.
Mm,
Even though nothing really takes the place of human contact, but but the idea of sort of looking at it like I looked at it as an obligation, you
right.
know, and after my father passed away, for me it was I felt obligated. It's like, I mean, not that I necessarily felt obligated exclusively and only, but also the idea that I was like for my mother, I'm like, coming for Shabbos and all of that. It's like and how could she be alone? Why
Right.
would I want her to be? And so that became almost like, of course, like a no-brainer to me, and so, and again, the point here is that it's about weighing pros and cons, and that rigidity could be very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the beginning, it was like it sort of was like, okay, we really didn't know what to expect, and the numbers were just climbing, you know
Mm-hmm.
um but now we have to make decisions. Now is the hard part because the government is not making the decisions for us, we're making them. I mean, the government makes certain decisions, or they give us certain guidelines, but there's so much flexibility within those guidelines that we still have to make decisions, you know such as for me the camp situation.
Right.
It was like, well,
Right.
there's camp, and it exists, but I don't know because some people are not sending. So my point is that that is something that I find is also very hard to do. And I also see clinically that people are becoming more anxious because once they were
Mm-hmm.
sort of at home with the stay-at-home order, it was like, okay, I know what I have to do to keep myself safe. I'm okay.
These are the
Once you
rules.
have to,
I'm
yeah,
going to follow
exactly.
them. What are the rules now?
Exactly. But now it's like, what are the rules? And then you see so much contradictions to those
Mm-hmm.
rules that you're like, wait a minute, what's the agenda behind the rules? And it's like, and now I have to make decisions. And then, for someone with anxiety, where there's an intolerance of doubt,
Mm-hmm.
like the what ifs, like what if I make the wrong decision? What if because of what I do or don't do, something bad will happen? Those decisions become that much more painful to
Mm-hmm.
make.
Absolutely. And also, there's also a lot of judging and anger.
Oh yeah, I
I'd love to hear
definitely see.
your take on that.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's also a matter of it's that because again, there's some flexibility in this,
Mm-hmm.
and I see it as well where in certain communities, it's sort of like you don't even notice that we're dealing with a situation that is still tied to COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and then literally like 5 minutes later, as you're walking, you're like, oh wait, now everyone is wearing masks,
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I see that there's so much judgment on both ends, on both
Mm-hmm.
sides of it. And the idea of, you're judging people for not taking it seriously enough. You're judging people for, judging you for not taking it seriously enough. And the idea that something that I've seen also is the idea that, people forget that your personal experience, that your personal experience doesn't necessarily color the general population. In other words, you know, if I live in an apartment with my kids, and it's like we don't have an A room, and
Right.
even if we did, where would we go? But the point isn't even that. The point is that it's different than living in a home with a backyard.
Right.
A close friend of mine who lives in Bergen County was like, I'm not sending my kids to camp, but she also has a pretty nice sized yard and a front yard, and her kids are much older, and it's very different, and
Right.
so like
Right.
it's
Right. In
hard to,
terms of like all the anger about the sleepaway camps,
yeah,
where they're saying how incredibly important it is, people who have backyards don't understand that.
they don't understand. And also, you know what, we don't understand this, but there are people who don't have internet. There
Right.
are people, for instance, who don't have Zoom. There
Right.
are people, for instance, whether it's because they choose not to for cultural reasons, or they can't afford it, but there are people, for instance, I can say that um, I live pretty close to a Target, and they had a line at one point that stretched to Avenue J. These are
Mm.
people who can't, and obviously if these people could buy things online, they would.
Right.
Why would you want to choose to stand online for 2 hours? You know what I'm saying? And so to judge people, or there was at one point there was somebody who was, I don't follow social media, but
Mm-hmm.
a close friend of mine was telling me about this whole debate that was going on about the fact that there was this. This was sort of like in, maybe it was at the end of April, beginning of May. So COVID was still sort of, it had peaked already, but it wasn't what it was now. Thank God we're at a much more comfortable place in
May it
terms of the
continue to go down.
yes, exactly, exactly. And so, but there was this father who had gone to the grocery store with his toddler, and people were really upset about it. And it's like, well, if the father had no choice, what is he supposed to do? And so the people that are judging just don't understand that their circumstances are actually more unique than they think, you know. And on the other hand, I mean, it's also the idea of there's a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunication,
Mm-hmm.
misinformation that's sort of
Mm-hmm.
being fed to an experience. And so the idea of even masks, not understanding what the function of the mask is and who it protects, you know.
Right. Right. And that's the problem, because we know that while the mask will protect you to some degree, it actually protects people around you to even a greater
Exactly.
degree. And there
Exactly.
lies the anger of
Yeah.
people who see someone
Exactly.
not wearing a mask. You are endangering me. It's not that I'm worried
Exactly.
about you. You're endangering me. And there is a level of hysteria, though.
Yeah, there's a level of, yes, there is definitely a level of hysteria, but I do believe that because, especially from our community, and we take the idea of chesed so seriously,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and we take the idea of communal responsibility very seriously. I think that if there was an understanding of that, I don't think there would be as much pushback, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in other words, the idea that when you're around, especially vulnerable populations, you know, that we respect the elderly very much, and we regard their safety as the greatest concern. Um, I do believe that if it was properly understood, people would respond differently. And at the same time, I remember seeing a notice in my elevator that children have to wear masks, children as young as 2, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
my 2-year-old's not wearing a mask. So it's also the idea that the guidelines need to make sense,
Right.
as
Be
a parent.
flexible. Right. I
It's like,
mean,
come on,
right.
what does that
To
mean?
right, to be crystal clear, children under the age of 2 cannot wear
Yeah,
masks.
I
It's
know.
considered
It's
risky.
very
And
frustrating.
I'm
It's like,
telling you, right, as a pediatrician, that not all
yeah,
children older than that can. And like you said, you have to be flexible. And we don't know. anything for certain about this virus, not one thing. But it looks like children are not the main spreaders of this. So I don't think we have to be hysterical about a child who's not wearing a mask.
Exactly, exactly. I think that it's about social communal responsibility, but
Mhm.
and at the same time understanding that people's experiences are different, and that you sort of have to balance those two ideas.
Right. But the
You
flip
know,
side is, and this is something I'm concerned about, is that while a lot of these communities who were hit the hardest, say Crown Heights, Borough Park, for
Right,
example,
right, right,
are
yeah,
saying they have herd immunity, which we don't know if that's true, but
we
certainly
don't
it
know.
looks like
Yeah,
they have been hit harder and have shown signs of potential immunity. We don't know what those antibodies even mean. But
exactly.
it's also, even though people have been out and about without as much protection, right? I'm just kind of generalizing here. We're not seeing a significant resurgence there. Thank God. And like I said, may it continue to go down.
We're not
Um,
exactly. No, we're not. And I and
but
I, I spent some time in Borough Park too. And yeah, what you're
right,
saying was what I saw. So
right. But what we have to realize is that there's a certain percentage of the population who may be the at risk, the greatest at risk, who
yeah.
hunkered down early because they knew they were at risk.
Well,
And
that's
those
always
are,
scary is that when they
yeah,
come out, what are we going to do?
right.
It's sort of like and that's sort of, and you're seeing that, like for instance, the bigger shoals, for instance, they're sort of dividing into different minyanim, and at one point they were saying under, over age 60 you can't come, and now they're sort of saying you can. So they're trying and they're being very cautious about it, you know, to remind everyone that we value life, you know? And so I just, I don't think it's a lack of value, you know, for life. If you were to, and that's where the judgment piece comes in, you
Hmm.
know? I don't think it has anything to do with that, because that's our one of our greatest values. That what's one of the greatest Torah values is life, and we do everything that we possibly can to prolong it. Hence the ventilators, you
Right,
know.
right. But if you perceive that it's over, you will not be as cautious as if you thought it was ongoing, and it
Right,
is
exactly.
very low, and a lot of people have had it already, so we can understand that, but we have to continue to protect the most vulnerable and also emotionally protect them because I
Yeah.
can't imagine what it'd be like to be someone who hasn't had it, who's living in this community or any community now who still has to
Oh,
hunker down
yeah.
because we're opening up, but they can't.
Or that they have to make decisions. Like, one of my aunts is really afraid to attend her grandson's wedding
Hmm.
because, her brother, that would be this is my father's sister,
Hmm.
passed away
Hmm.
from COVID. She never had COVID. Her daughter that she would be going to, because she's from out of state, did not have any antibodies.
Hmm.
And what is she supposed to do? And so she's very afraid of that. And I think her experience is not unique.
Right, no, for sure.
I mean, if it's not a wedding that you have to decide to go to, then it's something. It doesn't have to even be a simcha, but the idea of, like, at what point are you going to leave your home or enter that store or visit your children or your grandchildren, or I mean, at one point you're making a decision, and that's scary.
Right. And also, I think you mentioned before how when you were going through, what happened with your dad, and thank you for sharing that story with us. It's
Mm.
very, very personal and very hard. I'm sure it's very hard for you to do and very meaningful for us to hear it because unfortunately a lot of people have been through this. You mentioned that you just were doing things almost on autopilot, right? It was minute by minute. So I think it's one thing to deal with something traumatic immediately, but what about in the long term?
Absolutely. And I think it's also a matter of just recognizing that the hard part is not getting through it. The hard part is sort of adapting to the
Hmm.
aftermath, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
And I think that, there's 2 points that I was thinking about, which is that, when this all started, for instance, I thought, if it wouldn't be for the fact that people are dying, this would almost be a blessing, because you're reminded of the important things in life,
Hmm.
and you are spending, I mean, before then I wasn't spending that much time with my kids, and now I'm spending a lot more time with them. This was at the beginning. This is not 4 months later,
Right. That's the
I'm
silver
still
lining
having to,
stuff. Yeah.
yes, yes. And so I was like, okay, and so, like, your mind has to find it, otherwise, like, what's the alternative, really?
Hmm.
Um, but the idea was that, and I thought I was going to catch up on certain things. Mind you, my kids are little, and I had to balance. I was still working
Mm-hmm.
and managing their Zoom schedules and having them at home. And my husband works in healthcare, so he wasn't home, and then my dad. So it was one of those, and Pesach. So it was one of those things that I'm like, okay, whatever, it happens. But I realized at one point it was like, you know what? Nothing is getting done because it's survival is taking up my energy. In other
Right.
words, this is not a vacation. So you're not going to reorganize your closet, It was hard enough for me to make Pesach, but
Right.
but the idea is that this is actually very stressful. This is a very stressful time. And so the idea of stress is that, your expectation, you've got limited resources, and then your expectations are like, whoa, you have way higher expectations.
Right.
Like, how do I keep my, I'm a faculty member at Touro, so I had to keep my classes going. I also have a private practice, so I have to manage that. I had my children home, and then there's also the household that has to sort of stay somewhat clean-ish. And there's Pesach, that is my dad. And so I'm like, okay, I've got all these expectations. I have no resources, right? Because no babysitter, no cleaning up, none of that,
Right.
And it was like, okay, I will be stressed. I mean, that is the definition of stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was almost like an acceptance point,
Mm-hmm.
because honestly, if anybody would ask anyone, paint a picture 5 months ago and say, how do you think you're going to react 2 months in, you know, most people would have been like, no, that's not happening. I can't do that.
Right.
It tells us that, that we generally react better to things than we think we can. In other words, we have a lot more strength than we know we have.
We're more
You know,
resilient. We're more
yes,
resilient.
we are certainly more resilient. And I think, and the idea that we don't have to fully anticipate what life is going to throw at us is a true bracha, because there would be no way for us to know how we could react
Mm-hmm.
until we're in the situation and we act and we react. Which is why I don't look back at what happened with my father with regret. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously I'm sad about it, but
Right.
meaning that I don't, I think that, one of the things that I'm seeing now is that there's a lot of anger at the hospital system, at the, whether it's the city state level of like how things were handled in, and I understand it. I understand where
Mm-hmm.
the anger is coming from. It's an emotional response, which I think very often happens when you're feeling helpless.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to lash out at something or someone. Um, and I understand it. But you know what? I also understand that this was all part of for me, I feel like this was all part of the unfortunate tragedy that my family had to deal
Mm-hmm.
with. And that this was part of what was supposed to be, and the idea that we did the best we could with whatever we
Mm-hmm.
had, you know? And it's not to say that we shouldn't try harder. In other words, I think we can learn from this experience. I think we could set better goals for ourselves, for whether it's individually or as a family, as a community, as a country. Of course, we could set better goals. I still think that we did the best we could with what we had.
So that's good that you're able to get to that level of acceptance, but a lot of people seem to be getting stuck. What would you
Yeah.
say? What would you say to when someone should be seeking some kind of help?
Well, I think that it's a great question, because at what point does grief sort of like merge into depression? At what point does adjustment
Mm-hmm.
turn into more of like a stress reaction? Like trauma, for instance, is a stronger stressor. You know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
post-traumatic stress disorder. So
Mm-hmm.
we live with stress every day, but sometimes the stress overwhelms us, especially if there's like threatened death or serious injury, and then we're like, oh God, either to ourselves or someone that we love, or we've even witnessed it, and then we just can't get past that.
Mm-hmm.
And so really what you want to be looking at, the two main things I would say that you want to look at is the distress. So in other
Mm-hmm.
words, how often do you experience personal distress?
Mm-hmm.
So how often is it that you find yourself crying about, in my case, it would be my father.
Mm-hmm.
um, and how often does that happen? How intense is it? Am I able to sort of move on in my day, or does that color the rest of my day?
Mm-hmm.
What is the level of distress? So how frequently am I experiencing it? You know, how reactive am I? Because you can tell emotionally. I mean, if you're, you can tell if your reactions are strong, whether
Mhm.
it's like that you find yourself getting seriously irritated and yelling at your kids a lot.
Mhm.
You know that you're not your emotions are intense, So your emotional reactivity is always going to sort of correlate. It's going to relate to the intensity that you're experiencing your emotions,
Mhm.
and that's why people who cry, when intensely they're experiencing intense emotions. And how long do they last? So I
Mhm.
would say the first hallmark to know, oh gosh, I have a problem, is that the distress that you're feeling seems like it's overwhelming. I mean, because if you look at, let's say, grief, Shiva is different than the Shloshim, and then the Shloshim is different
Mhm.
than the rest of the year. And if you're still feeling like you're in a Shiva period or
Right.
even a Shloshim period, then you know there's something going on. You know what I'm saying? You know that there's some, you're gonna have sad points. I mean, I light candles. I think of my father. Of course I
Right.
get sad. I mean, these things are gonna happen. Or I have a memory of him doing something with my kids, and all of a sudden I'm like, and then I get sad. But
Right.
that's normal. I mean, that's
Normal.
going to
Mhm.
happen, and it's gonna happen out of nowhere, and it's spontaneous. Sometimes you can understand it. Sometimes it just seems to be like, what? you know so the first thing I would tell you again is the personal distress, and the second point I would say is, is it causing you not to sort of, is it preventing you from meeting your obligations, your responsibilities, being able to
Mhm.
function? You
Right.
know what I mean? Like what's the status of and what does your house look like? I mean, is it different than what it usually does? In other words, like, like, are you not able to sort of like, are you not able to get out of bed normally? Are you not able to take care of your kids? Are you not able to, let's say just meet whatever demands that you have, like whether it's work related or even social obligations,
Mhm.
you know, um, whatever that may be. But if, is it difficult for you to function? Can you sleep? What's
Right.
your appetite like?
Mhm.
So these are things that I would look at and I would say, again, there is a hallmark of grief period, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to get intervention. I mean, I think, for instance, that the social support that people don't have right now is
Right.
so needed. It's like I've been for the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to put together, for instance, a support group for my
Mhm.
mother, of spouses, comprised of spouses of those who passed away over COVID, because the tragedy is worst for the spouse,
Right.
and it happened so quickly, and it was like it wasn't supposed to, quote unquote,
Right.
happen. You know,
Right. Are you doing these support? Are you planning the support group to be live or to be, say, like on Zoom or some kind of media like
I
that?
would honestly, if people were comfortable with it, I would just say whatever people are comfortable with.
Mhm.
I actually started seeing people privately,
Mhm.
in person a week or two ago.
Mhm.
I spoke to my doctor about it, and I have the mask and the
Mhm.
6 feet apart
See
and the
part. Right.
sanitizer
Mhm.
and all of that. But I also know that it's different. OMH, for instance, the Office of Mental Health, they put out these guidelines, but that's different because if you're talking about a clinic where there's a lot more traffic,
Right.
it's very different. But in a private practice setting, so I would say, back to the original question, I think that the value would be incredible if it was in person. It's
Mhm.
also a matter of what people are comfortable with. um, my mother lives in Borough Park, so I would imagine that many people would be comfortable and some people would not be comfortable,
Mhm.
but I would say that there is tremendous value in doing it, period. And if you could do it in person, safely, then that would be, fantastic as well. But I see how much she needs it, and it's
Right.
like, that would help her even more than I think individual therapy at this
Mhm.
point.
Right. Because
So
so much of this is normal, and you
yeah.
realize it when you hear other people are going through the same thing you're going through.
Right, and also that for someone who recently lost a spouse, especially in this way,
Mhm.
then the fear of loneliness, the fear of
Mhm.
being alone, the fear of, she said, she's like, my mom was telling, she's like, I can't stop thinking about Rosh Hashanah, you
Mhm.
know? And I'm like thinking, wow, okay, so we're in Tammuz, that's Tishrei. It's like,
Right.
in other words, but I understand it because now you know, when you're married, it's like you get used to doing things as a unit, and now you
Right.
got to do it all alone. Aside from the fact that, like now you have to learn how to do things that you never had to do. Everyone has their roles, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
But if the spouse paid the bills or did the grocery shopping or the heavy lifting or whatever, something now, I don't know, light bulb needs to be changed. I'm just saying. The point is that it's a whole new experience, and you have to learn to live with that. And hearing other people's sort of, people's experiences, not only does it normalize it, but it makes you feel less lonely.
Right. And they may have tips also.
Yeah, exactly. Practically, like just solutions, of how to, sort of navigate this new world that you really didn't want. And that's the whole idea of acceptance. It's that the idea is that, if the people who are not able to accept this new reality are just suffering with it.
Right.
That isn't to say that we have to like it, or, the idea of we don't have to, approve of it. But we do need to accept it, because
Right.
otherwise you're just suffering.
Right. You have to cope with it. And if you're not coping, you should seek out help. And I'm just going to give a few resources. First, I'm just going to give your information again, just because I said it at the beginning. I'm going to say it at the end, because you are looking to form a support group, which I think is amazing. And I think that, you may end up having it be a combination of in-person and by Zoom. So
Yeah,
people who are not able to come
yeah,
or not comfortable coming. That's how,
sure.
I think you might end up doing it. Your phone number is 347-731-9837, and your email, perella.perlstein @touro.edu. And I just want to give a couple of resources for people who realize they need to get help now, so they can turn to these resources. One is Amudim, AMUDIM.org. Their hotline specifically for COVID-19 mental health services is 888-726-8346, and their general number is 646-517-0222. And there's also Relief, RELIEFHELP.org. 718-431-9501 is their Brooklyn number. So I thank you, Dr. Perlstein, so much for sharing everything with me tonight, including your personal story, and this being aliyah for the neshama of your father.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
You all take care.
You too.